A single man born into chaos would teach the world how to be human, not through armies or conquest, not through walls or gold, but through words spoken quietly in the shade of apricot trees. His empire was built of ideas so enduring that emperors would bow to them for 2,000 years. Yet when he entered the world, no oracle proclaimed his destiny. There were no celestial omens, no visiting wise men. Only a child born to a widow in a time when the old order was dying and no one knew what would replace it. Across the valleys of ancient China, the rhythm of the Bronze Age was giving way to something darker and more desperate. The Zhou dynasty, once glorious, had long since lost its grip. What remained was a patchwork of squabbling states, each ruled by lords who paid lip service to the royal house while sharpening their swords against one another. The spring and autumn period, as it would later be called, was an age of fracture, when ritual gave way to ambition, when nobility meant less than cunning, and when the old certainties dissolved like morning mist. In the midst of this slow unraveling lay the state of Lu, a small realm tucked into the eastern plains, bounded by hills and the distant sea. Lu was different from its neighbors. It held something the others had forgotten or abandoned: memory. Here, the ancient rites of the Zhou kings were still preserved, passed down through generations of careful scribes and solemn priests. While other states innovated and improvised, Lu remembered. Its temples held the bronze vessels of former ages. Its archives contained records of ceremonies performed when the dynasty still ruled with heaven's mandate. To be born in Lu was to be born into a museum of fading grandeur, a place where the past was cherished even as the future grew uncertain. Yet even Lu was not immune to decay. Three powerful families, the Ji, the Meng, and the Shu, dominated its politics. Their private armies larger than the Duke's own forces. They built fortified cities within the state's borders, miniature kingdoms unto themselves. The Duke, nominal ruler of Lu, held his throne by their permission, a figurehead draped in silk but empty of power. In the markets and fields, common people watched this slow erosion and wondered if heaven had withdrawn its blessing entirely. Into this world, in the year 551 BC, a child was born in the town of Khufu. His name was Confucius, though the world would come to know him by the honorific Master Kong, Confuzi in his own tongue, Confucius in the Latin that would carry his name across continents he never imagined. His father, Shuliang He, was an aging military officer of minor nobility, a man whose strength had earned him a place in local legend. Stories told of his battlefield courage. Once, it was said, he held up a fortress gate with his bare hands so his comrades could escape. But courage does not guarantee comfort. By the time Kongshu was conceived, Shuliang, he was in his 70s, his glory long past, his fortune modest at best. The family held noble blood, tracing their line back through generations to the Dukes of Song, but titles without wealth are like rain without clouds, impressive to mention, useless to live on. The circumstances of the marriage remained shadowed by discretion and rumor. Kongqiu's mother, Yan Zhengzhai, was young. Some said barely more than a girl. Whether she was a concubine, a second wife, or something negotiated between families who needed each other, the records do not clearly say. What is certain is that the union raised whispers. An old man, a young woman, a child born late in life. None of it followed the easy patterns of respectability. When Kongqiu was only 3 years old, his father died. With Shuliang, his death came displacement. The boy and his mother were separated from the main family line, left to fend for themselves on the margins of noble society. They were not destitute, but neither were they secure. Yan Zhengzai raised her son alone, in a world that offered little mercy to widows and less to fatherless boys of uncertain standing. Childhood for Kong Qiu was shaped by absence, the absence of a father's guidance, the absence of wealth and comfort, the absence of certainty about where he belonged. Yet his mother, though poor, possessed something more valuable than silver: determination. She ensured her son received an education, however modest. In a society where learning was the privilege of the established, she found ways to place him before teachers, to expose him to the classics, to let him glimpse the world of ritual and music that had once belonged to his ancestors. The boy was unusual. While other children played with sticks and dust, Kong Qiu arranged ritual vessels in careful patterns, imitating the ceremonies he had glimpsed in temples. He mimicked the movements of priests, the positioning of offerings, the rhythm of sacred music. His play was not play, but rehearsal. As though some part of him already understood that the world's salvation lay in getting the details right, in restoring what had been lost through carelessness and haste. His physical appearance, too, marked him as different. Observers later noted the unusual shape of his head, a slight depression at the crown, as though the skull dipped inward where it should have been level. This earned him his personal name, Qiu, meaning hill or mound. Whether the feature was truly so pronounced or merely exaggerated by storytellers seeking omens in retrospect, it became part of his legend. The child with the hollow head would one day fill the world with wisdom. But in those early years, there was no prophecy, only poverty and the quiet struggle to survive. Khufu was a small town, its streets narrow and muddy in spring, dusty in summer. Markets bustled on certain days. On others, silence hung over the alleys like fog. The boy watched merchants bargain, farmers deliver grain, officials pass in their carriages. He saw the world's hierarchy laid bare, those who commanded and those who obeyed, those who lived in compounds behind high walls, and those who slept beneath thatch. Around him, the political landscape of Lu continued its slow disintegration. Duke Zhao, the current ruler, was a figure of ceremony rather than command. He performed the sacrifices, hosted the banquets, and signed the decrees. But real decisions were made in the private halls of the three great families. Their retainers filled the government posts. Their preferences shaped the law. The duke's authority was respected in form, but ignored in fact. A preview of the disorder Kong Qiu would spend his life trying to reverse. The boy's education came in fragments. His mother could not afford the tutors of the wealthy, but she ensured he learned to read, to write, to recite the old poems. In this, Lu's reverence for tradition worked in his favor. The state maintained schools, however modest, where the sons of lesser families could study alongside the sons of nobles. Kong Qiu absorbed everything: the book of songs, with its verses of love and duty, the histories of the ancient sage kings, the principles of ritual propriety that governed everything from worship to warfare. He was drawn, above all, to two things: ritual and music. To most, these were mere ceremony, the decorations of power. To Kong Qiu, they were the architecture of civilization itself. Ritual, properly observed, shaped the heart. Music, rightly performed, harmonized the soul. Together, they could transform a beast into a sage, a mob into a community, chaos into cosmos. Even as a child, he sensed this, that the difference between order and anarchy was not force but form, not violence but virtue, cultivated through repetition and grace. Observers who remembered him from those years spoke of his seriousness. He was not dour or humorless, But neither did he waste time on frivolity. He had the focus of someone who understood, even before he could articulate it, that the world was broken and that mending it would require more than wishes. It would require work, patient, careful, and endless. The death of his mother when he was 17 brought that work into sharper focus. Yan Zhengzai had been his anchor, his only family, the one who had believed in him when no one else did. Her passing devastated him. According to the customs of filial piety, he withdrew into mourning. 3 years of simplicity and grief, living in a hut beside her grave, limiting his diet, refusing comfort, withdrawing from normal life. To later generations, this mourning would become exemplary, the model of how a son should honor a parent. But in the moment, it was simply sorrow. The young man who emerged from those 3 years of solitude was harder, quieter, more resolved. He had lost his mother, but he had also discovered something. That ritual was not merely tradition, but therapy, that structure could contain chaos, and that devotion to what was right mattered more than what was easy. After his mourning, Kong Chu made a journey. He traveled to Luoyang, the old Zhou capital, a city that still held the archives and temples of the dynasty's golden age. There, among scrolls and scholars, he drank deeply from the well of ancient knowledge. He studied the rites that the sage kings had practiced, the music they had composed, the principles by which they had governed. Some said he met an elderly archivist there, a man later remembered as Laozi, the old master. Though whether this meeting truly happened or was invented by later storytellers remains uncertain. What is certain is that Kong Shu returned from Luoyang transformed. He had seen the remnants of the world as it should be, and he understood now that his own age had fallen away from that standard. The spring and autumn period was not an age of innovation, but of amnesia. Society had forgotten how to be civilized, and unless someone reminded it, the descent into barbarism would continue until nothing remained but warlords and ashes. The young man who walked back along the dusty roads to Khufu was no longer simply Kong Chu, fatherless son of a widow. He was a student of the way, the Tao, the path that the ancient sages had walked and that his own generation had abandoned. He did not yet know that he would become a teacher, that disciples would gather around him, that his name would be spoken in reverence for millennia. He knew only that the world was broken and that somewhere in the old songs and forgotten rituals lay the pattern for mending it. As he approached the gates of Khufu, the sun dipped low behind the hills, casting long shadows across the fields. Farmers walked home beside their oxen. Guards leaned on their spears at the watchposts. Smoke rose from cooking fires in 1,000 small homes. It was an ordinary evening in an ordinary town, and yet, in the heart of one quiet traveller, something extraordinary had taken root. The boy born into chaos had begun to imagine order, and in that imagination lay the seed of everything that would follow. A vision so powerful that it would outlive kingdoms, reshape civilizations, and teach the world, for better and worse, what it meant to be human. The stage was set. The teacher was almost ready. All that remained was for life to place before him the students who would carry his words beyond the sunset and into eternity. The years after Luoyang were years of hunger, not for food, but for understanding. Kong Shu had glimpsed the architecture of civilization in those dusty archives, seen the blueprint of a world that once worked, and now he could not unsee it. Everywhere he looked in his own age, he found the pattern broken, the design abandoned, the careful balance replaced by improvisation and greed. If he was to do anything about it, he would first need to master what had been lost. Education in those days was not the orderly thing it would later become. There were no universities, no standardized curricula, no certificates of completion. Learning happened wherever knowledge lived, in the homes of aging scholars, in the corners of ancestral temples, in the memories of old musicians who still knew the songs from the time before. Forgetting, Confucius sought out every source he could find, studying with a determination that bordered on obsession. His curriculum was ancient, passed down through generations, with the reverence one might reserve for sacred relics. It was called the 6 Arts, and together they formed the education of any man who aspired to serve in government or uphold the values of the noble class. Yet for Confucius, these were not merely skills to be acquired. They were doorways into the mind of heaven itself. The first was ritual, li, the art of proper conduct in every circumstance. This was more than etiquette or ceremony. Ritual was the physical manifestation of inner virtue, the way a person's character became visible to the world. Every gesture mattered. How one bowed, how one offered sacrifice, how one received a guest, how one mourned the dead. Get the ritual wrong, and disorder leaked into the world like water through a cracked vessel. Get it right, and harmony flowed from person to family, from family to state, from state to all beneath heaven. Confucius watched ceremonies with the intensity of a man decoding scripture. When priests performed sacrifices at the ancestral temples, he stood at the edge of the courtyard, memorizing every movement, every placement of vessels, every syllable of prayer. He noticed when the younger priests grew careless, when they rushed through the forms or positioned the offerings incorrectly. Such lapses pained him physically, as though someone had played a false note in a perfect melody. The second art was music, yue, and here Confucius found not just study, but solace. Music, the ancients taught, was the language of cosmic harmony. When performed correctly, it aligned the human heart with the patterns of heaven and earth. Different modes produced different effects. Some stirred courage, others cultivated tranquility, still others inspired reverence. A wise ruler used music to shape his people's character, just as a gardener used water to shape his plant's growth. Confucius learned to play the qin, a 7-stringed zither whose sound was both delicate and profound. He practiced for hours, his fingers moving across the strings until they bled, then healing, then bleeding again. Later in life, people would remember how he could lose himself entirely in music, forgetting to eat, forgetting the passing of time. Once, after hearing a performance of the ancient Shao music, said to have been composed by the sage emperor Shun, he reportedly did not taste meat for 3 months, so overwhelmed was he by its perfection. I never imagined, he said, that music could reach such heights. The third and fourth arts were archery and charioteering, martial skills that distinguished the noble from the common. Confucius trained in both, though his talent lay more in understanding their principles than in physical prowess. Archery taught focus and self-discipline. Success came not from strength, but from inner stillness. Charioteering required coordination and awareness, the ability to control powerful forces through subtle guidance. Both were metaphors for governance itself. The sage ruler, like the skilled archer or charioteer, achieved his aims through minimal intervention, perfect timing, and harmony with natural patterns. The fifth art was calligraphy, shu, the writing of characters with brush and ink. This was more than mere literacy. The way a man formed his characters revealed his character. Hasty, careless strokes indicated a hasty, careless mind. Balanced, deliberate characters reflected inner discipline and clarity. Confucius practiced endlessly, seeking not beauty alone, but truthfulness. Each stroke a small act of honesty, each character a miniature portrait of the cosmos rendered in black ink on pale silk. The sixth art was mathematics, Shu, the study of numbers and their patterns. Though this received less attention than the others, it taught the mind to think precisely, to see relationships, to understand proportion and balance. In a world governed by the way, nothing happened by accident. Every number, every measurement, every ratio reflected underlying principles that, properly understood, revealed heaven's design. Through these six doorways, Confucius entered the thought world of the ancients. But his education was not merely technical. What set him apart from other students of his generation was his conviction that these arts were not ornaments, but necessities, not traditions to be preserved out of sentimentality, but tools for rebuilding a shattered world. He began to form a coherent vision, a philosophy that would guide him the rest of his days. At its center stood the concept of Ren, often translated as benevolence, humanness, or goodness. But Ren was larger than any single word could contain. It was the quality that made a person fully human, the capacity to feel for others as one felt for oneself. A person of Ren treated others with the care and respect they would want for themselves. From Ren flowed all other virtues: righteousness, Yi, wisdom, Ji, trustworthiness, Xin, and ritual propriety, Li. Confucius understood that society's collapse was not ultimately political or economic. It was moral. When rulers stopped being virtuous, when nobles cared only for power, when common people lost faith in justice, the bonds that held civilization together dissolved. No amount of law or force could replace what was lost. Only a return to virtue, cultivated in the heart and expressed in action, could heal the fractures. He also began to articulate an idea that would become central to his teaching: Zhengming, the rectification of names. This meant ensuring that words matched reality, that things were called what they truly were. When a ruler did not truly rule, when a father did not truly father, when a minister did not truly minister, society fell into confusion. People no longer knew what was expected of them, what they could trust, what principles governed their lives. The first task of reform, therefore, was linguistic. Restore the meaning of words, and you restore the structure of reality itself. These insights came slowly, built from countless hours of study, observation, and reflection. Confucius was in his 20s now, unmarried as yet, living modestly on the margins of Lu's society. His noble ancestry granted him some access to the educated class, but his poverty and fatherless background kept him from the inner circles of power. He existed in a liminal space, neither fully common nor truly elite, and perhaps that very marginality sharpened his vision. He could see both the pretensions of the nobles and the sufferings of the people, understanding from lived experience how far the ideal had diverged from the real. In these years, he also began to grapple with a question that would haunt him throughout his life. What was his relationship to the past? Some saw tradition as dead weight, customs maintained out of habit rather than wisdom. Others clung to the past with blind nostalgia, refusing to acknowledge that times had changed. Confucius sought a middle path. The ancients, he believed, had achieved something extraordinary: a harmonious society governed by virtue rather than force. That achievement was not arbitrary or accidental. It reflected genuine insight into human nature and the patterns of heaven. Therefore, it deserved preservation and transmission. Yet he did not wish merely to imitate. "I transmit, but do not create," he would later say. "I believe in and have a passion for the ancients. This was not false modesty, but genuine conviction. He saw himself not as an innovator, but as a conduit, a living link between a golden age and a fallen present. His task was not to invent new truths, but to recover old ones, to polish away the accumulated dust of centuries and reveal the wisdom that had always been there, waiting to be rediscovered. As his 20s progressed, Confucius' reputation began to spread in small circles. Elders who heard him speak were impressed by his knowledge and seriousness. Young men seeking guidance found in him a teacher who combined vast learning with practical wisdom. He was not yet gathering formal disciples, that would come later, but already he was becoming known as someone who understood the old ways, who could explain the meanings behind ceremonies that others performed by rote, who could articulate principles that others felt but could not express. He also began to attract attention for something else: his insistence that learning should not be the exclusive property of the nobility. In an age when education was largely determined by birth, Confucius argued that virtue and ability mattered more than bloodline. Anyone willing to learn, anyone capable of Ren, deserved instruction. This was not a call for social revolution. He never challenged the basic hierarchies of his society, but it was a quiet radicalism, nonetheless. Wisdom, he believed, could arise from any quarter, and to waste it because of class prejudice was to impoverish the world. The people of Khufu grew accustomed to seeing the young scholar walking through the market, pausing to observe, to listen, to think. He moved through the world with an alertness that others lacked, as though he were constantly comparing what he saw with an invisible standard. Sometimes he stopped to correct a merchant's weights, pointing out gently that fairness in measurement was the foundation of trust. Other times, he watched children at play and saw in their games the patterns of ritual yet to be learned. On festival days, when the duke performed sacrifices and the three great families gathered for ceremonies, Confucius attended as a spectator. Noting every detail, he saw how the rituals had degraded over time. Prayers shortened, vessels misplaced, priests ignorant of the meanings behind their actions. Yet even in decay, the structure persisted, like the bones of a great building, still visible beneath ivy and neglect. If the structure remained, he thought, perhaps it could be restored. In the quiet of evening, he practiced his music, meditated on the classics, and imagined the world as it could be. A world where rulers governed through moral example rather than force, where ministers served out of duty rather than ambition, where fathers taught virtue, sons practiced filial piety, and the rhythm of society matched the rhythm of the cosmos. It was not a naive dream, but a disciplined vision, rooted in history and refined by study. The young scholar did not yet know that he would spend his life trying to realize that vision, that he would gather followers who saw in him not just a teacher, but a living embodiment of the way, that his words would be collected and studied by generations yet unborn. He knew only that the path of the ancients was the right path, and that if no one else would walk it, he would walk it alone. As the decade of his 20s drew toward its close, Confucius stood at a threshold. Behind him lay years of learning, of patient accumulation of knowledge and wisdom. Ahead lay the world, chaotic, suffering, hungry for guidance it did not know how to ask for. Soon he would step across that threshold, moving from student to teacher, from observer to actor. But for now, in these final years of preparation, he simply studied, practiced, and refined his understanding. The sun set over Khufu, painting the walls of the city in shades of amber and rose. Somewhere in a modest room, a young man closed the scroll he had been reading, set down his brush, and sat in silence. The ancients whispered to him from across the centuries, and he listened, preparing himself for the day when he would speak their wisdom into a world that had forgotten how to hear. That day was closer than he knew. A man cannot live on philosophy alone, however profound his understanding. The world demands bread and shelter, obligations and connections. As Confucius entered his late 20s, the question of livelihood pressed upon him with increasing urgency. Study had filled his mind. Now he needed to fill his rice bowl. Marriage came first, as it did for most men of his station. The details are sparse, preserved more as outline than portrait. He married, fathered a son whom he named Kong Li, and quite possibly daughters as well, though the records remain uncertain on this point. His family life, by all accounts, was conventional but not warm. Later, scholars would note the distance between father and son, a relationship marked more by correctness than affection. Perhaps Confucius, who had grown up without a father, did not know how to be one. Or perhaps his heart belonged so completely to his studies and his vision that little remained for the intimate bonds of family. What is certain is that he needed work. Noble blood and vast learning might earn respect, but they did not pay for millet or lamp oil. In lieu, as in every state of the age, government service offered the only reliable path for educated men without wealth. And so Confucius entered the world of administration, accepting positions that would have struck some as beneath a man of his learning, but which he approached with the same seriousness he brought to everything else. His first appointment was as keeper of granaries, a position responsible for storing and distributing grain. It was humble work, the kind given to minor functionaries, yet he performed it with meticulous care. He ensured accurate measurements, prevented theft and spoilage, kept detailed records of what came in and what went out. To others, it was merely logistics. To Confucius, it was governance in miniature, fairness in distribution, honesty in accounting, reliability in execution. If he could not be trusted with grain, how could he be trusted with greater responsibilities? Later, he served as manager of public pastures, overseeing the herds that provided meat and leather for the state. Again, he brought precision to what others might have treated as routine. The animals thrived under his care. The records remained accurate. The system functioned as it should. His superiors noticed. Here was a man who did not cut corners, who took pride in small tasks, who understood that excellence was a habit practiced in obscurity long before it was recognized in public. These years of modest service taught him truths that books could not. He saw how easily corruption crept into even simple systems. A false measure here, an overlooked theft there, gradually eroding trust and efficiency. He witnessed how a government's character revealed itself in details, whether officials arrived on time, whether complaints were heard, whether the weak received the same justice as the strong. The distance between order and chaos, he realized, was maintained not by grand gestures, but by daily discipline. He also observed Lu's deeper dysfunction with growing clarity. The state's nominal rulers, the Duke and his court, were prisoners of ceremony. They performed the rituals, issued the proclamations, and received the honors, yet their words carried no weight. Real power belonged to the three great families, the Ji, Meng, and Shu, who commanded private armies, controlled vast estates, and treated the Duke's authority as a polite fiction. Ministers who should have served the state served their family interests. Instead, nobles who should have embodied virtue competed only for advantage. The system's corruption was not the crude sort, open bribery and naked theft, but something more insidious, a slow replacement of principle with expedience, loyalty with calculation, duty with ambition. No one could point to the moment when virtue died, yet everyone felt its absence. Laws were bent to serve the powerful. Disputes were settled by influence rather than justice. Positions went to the connected rather than the capable. Confucius watched this with a scholar's analytical eye and a moralist's anguish. The diagnosis became clear to him. Society had inverted its priorities. It valued cleverness over character, force over righteousness, immediate gain over long-term harmony. The rulers sought to maintain order through punishment and reward, through laws and threats, never understanding that true order could only come from within, from the cultivation of virtue in rulers and ruled alike. His philosophy deepened in these years, shaped by the friction between what he learned in the classics and what he saw in the streets. He became convinced that government was fundamentally an educational enterprise. A ruler's primary task was not to control his people, but to transform them through moral example. When the ruler was virtuous, the people naturally followed virtue. When ministers were honest, honesty spread through the administration. When fathers practiced propriety and sons practiced filial piety, the family became the foundation of social stability. This was the concept that would later be called government by virtue, de ji, as opposed to government by law, fa ji. Confucius did not oppose laws. They had their place, but he believed they could never substitute for inner moral development. Laws told people what not to do. Virtue taught them what to do and inspired them to do it willingly. A society governed by laws produced obedience through fear. A society governed by virtue produced goodness through aspiration. Central to this vision was the concept he called Ren, which he had begun to articulate in his 20s, but now refined through experience. Ren was the quality that made a person fully human, the capacity to feel for others as one felt for oneself. It manifested as compassion, as fairness, as the refusal to do to others what one would not want done to oneself. This last formulation, the negative version of what later ages would call the Golden Rule, became one of his core teachings. Do not impose on others what you yourself do not desire. It was simple, memorable, and profound. But Ren alone was not enough. It required structure, channels through which to flow. That structure was Lai, ritual propriety, the forms of conduct that gave shape to virtue. Without Li, Ren remained vague and formless, like water without a vessel. With Li, Ren became concrete, visible, teachable. A person learned virtue not through abstract contemplation, but through practicing its forms, bowing correctly, speaking appropriately, mourning sincerely. The body taught the heart, and the heart gradually transformed the person. Another key concept emerged during these years: Yai, righteousness or moral rightness. Yia was the compass that pointed toward what was right in any situation. Regardless of personal advantage, it was the quality that allowed a person to choose principle over profit, duty over comfort, the long-term good over the immediate pleasure. A person of Yao could not be bribed, could not be intimidated, could not be swayed from the path of virtue by any external force. Confucius also refined his thinking about Junzi, the superior man or gentleman. Originally, Junzi had meant simply a person of noble birth. The son of a lord, Confucius, kept the term but radically redefined it. A true gentleman, he insisted, was not made by birth but by cultivation. Junzi referred to anyone, noble or common, who had developed virtue through study and practice. Such a person was marked not by their title or wealth, but by their character. They were sincere, trustworthy, courageous without being reckless, principled without being rigid, learned without being pedantic. Opposite the Yunzi stood the Jiaoren, the small person or petty man. The petty person pursued only immediate self-interest, changed principles as circumstances shifted, valued profit over righteousness, and lived without regard for the greater good. The distinction was not one of class, but of character. A noble could be petty, a commoner could be a gentleman. What mattered was the direction of one's cultivation, the objects of one's striving. Through his minor government posts, Confucius also began to develop his theory of zhengming, the rectification of names. He had glimpsed this idea earlier, but now he saw its practical urgency. In Lu, rulers who did not rule still bore the title of ruler. Ministers who served family interests rather than the state still bore the title of minister. Fathers who neglected their children still bore the title of father. This confusion of name and reality created chaos. People no longer knew what was expected of them, what they could trust, how to behave. When words lost their meaning, society lost its structure. The solution, he believed, was to restore the correspondence between name and reality. A ruler must truly rule, not through force, but through moral example. A minister must truly minister, serving the common good rather than private advantage. A father must truly father, teaching and guiding his children with wisdom and love. When each person fulfilled the duties attached to their role, harmony emerged naturally. These ideas were not yet polished into maxims, not yet organized into a coherent system. They existed as insights scattered through his mind like stars waiting to be mapped into constellations. But the fundamental pattern was already clear. Virtue must be cultivated, roles must be fulfilled, form must match function, rulers must lead through example, and society must be built from the inside out, beginning with the transformation of individual hearts. As the years passed, Confucius' reputation grew. He was known as a man of integrity, someone who could be trusted with responsibility, however modest. He was also becoming known as someone who thought deeply about governance, who could articulate principles that others felt but could not express. Men began to seek his counsel, not in great numbers yet, but enough to suggest that his insights resonated beyond his own mind. He was approaching his 30s, and his character had solidified into the form it would maintain the rest of his life. He was serious without being grim, principled without being rigid, learned without being arrogant. He believed passionately in his vision, but did not impose it through argument or force. He taught by example, spoke when asked, and maintained a quiet dignity that drew people to him. Yet frustration simmered beneath the surface. He held minor posts in a corrupt system, performing small tasks well, while the state itself drifted further into disorder. He understood the principles that could restore harmony, but no one in power asked his opinion on matters of consequence. The great families continued their intrigues. The Duke continued his empty ceremonies, and the people continued to suffer the slow erosion of justice and stability. Still, he did not despair. He had learned patience from the ancients, had seen in their example that true transformation required time, that virtue spread slowly but surely. When properly cultivated, his task now was not to seize power or launch a revolution, but to prepare himself, to continue his studies, to deepen his understanding, and to wait for the moment when his knowledge might be put to use. That moment would come, though not as soon as he hoped. For now, he worked in obscurity, managing granaries and pastures, raising his family, and refining the philosophy that would one day reshape the world. The keeper of grain did not yet know that he was gathering something far more precious and enduring, the seeds of a teaching that would feed the spirits of millions yet unborn. The evening lamps burned in Khufu as officials completed their accounts and locked the government storehouses. Among them, one man lingered a moment longer, checking his records one last time, ensuring that everything was in order. Then he walked home through streets he had known all his life, past temples where rituals were performed carelessly, past compounds where power was hoarded and virtue forgotten. But he did not walk alone, though no one accompanied him. With him walked the shade of the Duke of Zhou, the spirits of the sage kings, the wisdom of centuries waiting to be reborn. His time of preparation was nearly complete. Soon the students would come and the teaching would begin. It began quietly, as most transformations do. No proclamation announced the opening of a school. No building was dedicated to the purpose. There was simply a man who understood the old ways, and other men, younger, searching, dissatisfied with the world as they found it, who came to learn from him. Beneath a tree, in a courtyard, along the roadside during walks, the teaching took shape. Confucius was in his early 30s when the first students appeared. Some came recommended by elders who had noticed the young scholar's depth of knowledge. Others heard him speak at ceremonies or government functions and sought him out afterward with questions. Still others simply sensed in him something their age lacked, a compass pointing toward true north, a voice speaking truths their own hearts recognized but could not articulate. What drew them was not charisma in the conventional sense. Confucius did not dazzle with oratory or overwhelm with force of personality. He was reserved, careful in speech, slow to commit to judgment, but when he did speak, his words carried weight. They seemed to come not from opinion, but from something deeper, an understanding that had been tested against both ancient wisdom and lived experience. He did not argue, he clarified. He did not persuade, he illuminated. His radical innovation was simple but revolutionary. He would teach anyone willing to learn, regardless of birth. In an age when education was the privilege of the nobility, when knowledge passed from father to son within aristocratic families, this was a quiet challenge to the established order. Confucius never called for the overthrow of hierarchy. He believed in social order, in ranks and roles, but he insisted that virtue and ability mattered more than bloodline. A peasant's son with the capacity for Ren deserved instruction as much as a duke's heir. His fee was modest, almost symbolic. Tradition held that he asked only for a bundle of dried meat, enough to show sincerity, but not enough to exclude those of limited means. What he demanded instead was commitment. Students must be willing to work, to think, to struggle with ideas that did not yield themselves easily. He had no patience for laziness or superficiality, but infinite patience for genuine effort, however slow. The students who gathered around him formed a remarkable constellation of personalities. Each brought different strengths and weaknesses, different questions and aspirations. Confucius treated no two alike. He understood that teaching was not the transmission of information, but the cultivation of character. And character required individual attention, tailored guidance, patience with particular flaws, and recognition of particular gifts. Among the earliest was Yan Hui, who would become his favorite disciple. Yan Hui was young, poor, of humble origin, yet possessed a capacity for virtue that astonished his teacher. He lived in the poorest quarter of the city, eating simple food from a bamboo bowl, drinking water from a gourd dipper, dwelling in a narrow alley where others would have found only misery. Yet he remained cheerful, devoted entirely to learning and self-cultivation. Admirable indeed, is Yan Hui, Confucius would later say. A handful of rice to eat, a gourd of water to drink, living in a shabby lane. Others would find such conditions unbearable, but Yan Hui's joy remains undiminished. Then came Zilu, as different from Yan Hui as winter from summer. Zilu was a warrior type, brave, blunt, impulsive, quick to anger and quick to act. He had likely been a minor military officer or guard before becoming a student. At first, he seemed an unlikely disciple for a teacher of ritual and restraint. Yet Confucius saw in him something worth cultivating: courage that could be channeled, energy that could be disciplined, loyalty that once given would never waver. With Zilu, the teacher worked to temper rashness with reflection, to teach that true courage included knowing when not to fight. Zigong arrived with different gifts. Clever, articulate, eventually wealthy through trade, he possessed diplomatic skills and worldly success that Confucius himself never achieved. Zigong would become a successful merchant and negotiator, moving between states on missions of statecraft, yet always returning to his teacher for guidance. With Zigong, Confucius emphasized that cleverness without virtue was merely cunning, that success without righteousness was hollow achievement. Zhengzi joined the circle somewhat later, earnest and devoted, focused above all on filial piety and the transmission of the master's teachings. He lacked Yan Hui's natural aptitude and Zigong's brilliance, but he compensated through sheer dedication. Confucius recognized in him a faithful transmitter, someone who would preserve the teachings accurately, even if he did not innovate upon them. Ranqiu brought administrative and military talent, practical, efficient, capable of managing complex affairs. He would later serve the powerful Ji family, a source of tension with his teacher, who disapproved of working for those who usurped legitimate authority. Yet Confucius valued Ranqiu's abilities and hoped to guide him toward using them rightly. Zixia was the scholar among them, focused on textual study and interpretation. He loved the classics, delighted in unpacking their meanings, and would later become known for his teaching of the ancient texts. With Zixia, Confucius emphasized that mere knowledge of words was insufficient. One must live the principles the texts embodied. The teaching method was conversational, adaptive, almost musical in its responsiveness. Confucius did not lecture from a fixed curriculum, but responded to each student's questions and character. With the hesitant, he urged boldness. With the impulsive, he counseled restraint. He used the same principle to teach different lessons, tailored to what each student needed to hear. When I have presented one corner of a subject, he said, and the student cannot come back to me with the other 3 corners, I do not repeat myself. He expected his students to think, to extrapolate, to engage actively with ideas rather than passively receive them. The learning happened not in the transfer of information, but in the struggle to understand. Questions were his primary tool. Rather than delivering answers, he would pose questions that forced students to examine their assumptions, to think through implications, to discover truths themselves. This method, later called Socratic, though Confucius practiced it centuries before Socrates, created understanding that lodged deep in the mind because students had worked for it, earned it through their own effort. The curriculum centered on the classical texts that Confucius himself had mastered: the Book of Songs, the Book of Documents, the ritual texts, and the principles of music. But he taught these not as dead artifacts, but as living wisdom applicable to present circumstances. The Book of Songs, a collection of ancient poetry, became in his hands a textbook of emotion and ethics. Its verses about love, loss, joy, and duty he used to teach students how to feel appropriately, how to express emotion with grace. how to understand human nature in its complexity. The 300 poems, he said, can be summed up in a single phrase: think no evil. The book of documents, containing speeches and edicts of ancient sage kings, taught the principles of virtuous governance. Through these texts, students learned how the early rulers had maintained order through moral example rather than force, how they had cultivated virtue in themselves before attempting to govern others. The ritual texts taught precision, propriety, the importance of form in shaping character. Confucius insisted that his students learn not just to perform rituals, but to understand their meaning. A bow was not merely a gesture, but an expression of respect. An offering was not merely a gift, but an acknowledgement of dependence and gratitude. Every action in ritual had significance, and through constant practice, these meanings worked their way into the heart. Music instruction went beyond technical skill. Confucius taught that different modes affected character differently. Proper music cultivated harmony within the soul. Corrupt music stirred base desires. A state's music revealed its moral condition. He often played the shin for his students, demonstrating how a composition should be performed, with what tempo, what emotional shading, what inner stillness. Yet the teaching was not all texts and ritual. Confucius believed in learning through observation of life. He walked with his students through markets, observing how merchants conducted trade, whether they measured fairly, whether they dealt honestly. He attended government proceedings, pointing out silently or discussing later when officials acted justly or unjustly. He watched farmers at work and drew lessons about timing, patience, the importance of preparation. His informal school became a kind of community, bound together by shared purpose and mutual respect. The students came from different backgrounds and would pursue different careers, but during their time with the master, they formed bonds that would last their lives. They studied together, debated among themselves, and learned as much from each other as from Confucius' direct instruction. The master established certain rules for this community. Students must address each other with courtesy, must help those who struggled, must never use learning as a weapon of pride. Competition was acceptable, indeed inevitable, but it must be competition in virtue, not in cleverness or one-upmanship. The goal was mutual elevation, not individual triumph. Confucius also taught by example. His own conduct became the curriculum. Students watched how he treated servants, how he spoke to elders, how he mourned, how he celebrated, how he handled frustration or disappointment. They saw that he practiced what he taught, that ritual was not empty form for him, but living expression, that benevolence was not abstract concept, but concrete action. His sense of humor emerged in these intimate settings. With his students, the reserved scholar revealed a playful side, teasing them gently about their foibles, laughing at appropriate moments, using wit to make points that earnestness could not reach. Yet his humor was never cruel or mocking. It served the same purpose as his questions, to illuminate, to provoke thought, to help students see themselves more clearly. He was also remarkably humble about the limits of his knowledge. When asked about spirits and the afterlife, he redirected, "Not yet able to serve people, how can you serve spirits? Not yet understanding life, how can you understand death?" He refused to speculate about what he did not know, focusing instead on the ethical life here and now. This intellectual honesty, the willingness to say, "I do not know," was itself a teaching. Word of the school spread gradually through Lu and beyond. Parents heard of a teacher who transformed their sons from idle youth into serious students of virtue. Officials heard of young men who understood the ancient principles of governance. Nobles heard of a scholar who could explain the meanings behind ceremonies they performed without understanding. The number of students grew. In time, Confucius would teach 3,000 students, tradition claimed, though 72 would master his teachings completely. Whether these numbers are accurate or symbolic, they capture a truth. The teaching that began beneath a tree had become a movement, quiet but steady, spreading through Lu like roots through soil. Yet Confucius harbored no illusions about his impact. The state remained corrupt. The great families still usurped authority, and the duke still reigned without ruling. His students might become men of virtue, but could they change a system that rewarded vice? Could wisdom triumph over power? Could education overcome entrenched interests? These questions had no easy answers, but the master had planted seeds, and seeds, properly tended, have a way of growing long after the gardener has gone. In the shade of apricot trees, beside the walls of Khufu, something new had entered the world, not a doctrine or a dogma, but a living transmission of wisdom from heart to heart, mind to mind, generation to generation. The teaching had begun. And though the world outside remained chaotic, within the circle of students, order had taken root. They had found in their master not just knowledge, but a way of being, not just answers, but a method of asking, not just tradition, but transformation. As evening fell and the students departed to their homes, Confucius remained a moment longer, gathering the scrolls they had studied, straightening the cushions where they had sat. The work was endless, the challenges immense, the outcome uncertain. But for the first time in his life, he was doing what he was meant to do. The teacher had emerged, and in the lives of those he taught, the ancient way would walk again. For years, Confucius had taught from the margins, a private scholar whose influence extended no further than his circle of students. He had studied governance, understood its principles, articulated a vision of how society should be ordered. Yet all of it remained theoretical, ideas without the test of application. Then, as he entered his late 40s, circumstances shifted. The state of Lu, desperate for capable administrators, began to notice the teacher with the growing reputation for wisdom and integrity. The invitation came quietly, as such things did. Would he accept a position in the government? Nothing grand at first. A magistracy in a small town, perhaps, or an advisory role in the Ministry of Justice. The salary would be modest but steady, the responsibilities real but manageable. For a man who had spent his youth managing granaries, it was hardly a dramatic elevation. Yet it represented something he had long desired, the chance to put his principles into practice, to demonstrate that virtue could indeed govern, that the ancient way was not merely beautiful theory, but workable reality. He accepted. His students watched with mixed feelings, pride that their master was finally receiving recognition, anxiety that his teaching might suffer, curiosity about whether the man who spoke so eloquently about governance could actually govern Confucius, shared their uncertainty but not their doubt. He had spent decades preparing for this moment, studying how the sage kings had ruled, understanding where his own age had gone astray. If given authority, however limited, he would show that order could be restored through righteousness rather than force. His early appointments proved his competence beyond question. He brought to government the same meticulous attention he had brought to managing pastures and grain stores years before records were kept precisely. Disputes were settled fairly. Procedures that had grown lax through habit were tightened through patient insistence. Officials who expected to continue their comfortable corruption found themselves gently but firmly held to standards they had long ignored. What surprised his colleagues was not his competence. Capable administrators were not rare, but his manner. He governed without arrogance, corrected without humiliation, enforced without cruelty. When subordinates made honest mistakes, he taught them better methods. When they committed deliberate wrongs, he removed them from office, but treated them with dignity. Justice, in his hands, was not vengeance, but correction, an attempt to restore proper relationships rather than simply punish deviation. His reputation grew. The people in districts under his administration noticed that courts became more fair, that officials could not be bribed, that the powerful received no special treatment. Merchants discovered that weights and measures were verified regularly, that contracts were enforced impartially. Farmers found that tax collectors no longer demanded more than the law allowed. Small improvements, perhaps, but in an age when justice was largely a commodity purchased by the wealthy, even small improvements felt revolutionary. Lu's court began to pay attention. Here was a man who combined learning with effectiveness, principle with pragmatism. As his successes accumulated, he rose through the ranks. He became Minister of Public Works, overseeing construction and maintenance throughout the state. Then, around the year 500 BC, he received an appointment that would define his political career. Minister of Justice, or something very close to it. The historical records used different titles, but the authority was clear. In this capacity, Confucius had the power to shape Lu's legal system according to his philosophy. He implemented reforms designed to make justice accessible to all. Not merely the privileged court procedures became more transparent. Punishments were proportioned carefully to offences, harsh enough to deter crime, mild enough to allow reformation. He insisted that judges investigate thoroughly before rendering judgment, that accusers provide evidence rather than merely make assertions, that the accused have opportunity to defend themselves. Yet his deeper impact came not through new laws, but through moral suasion. He believed that the best government governed least because its people governed themselves. When officials were virtuous, when they embodied honesty and fairness, the people naturally followed their example. Crime decreased not because punishment became more severe, but because the social fabric strengthened, because communities recovered a sense of shared standards and mutual responsibility. His influence extended beyond Lu's borders. Other states took notice of the realm's increasing stability and prosperity. Visitors returned home with stories of a minister who governed through wisdom rather than force, whose courts dispensed justice without favoritism, whose very presence seemed to inspire better conduct. Confucius' fame began to spread across the fractured landscape of warring states. The culmination of his political success came in the year 500 BC at a place called Jiagu. Duke Ding of Lu was scheduled to meet Duke Jing of the neighboring state of Qi for a diplomatic conference. Such meetings were delicate affairs, opportunities for negotiation, but also for intimidation and trickery. Qi was the stronger power, and its representatives saw the conference as a chance to extract concessions or humiliate Lu's ruler. Confucius accompanied Duke Ding as an advisor. When they arrived at the appointed place, the Qi delegation staged an elaborate ceremony designed to impress and overwhelm armed dancers. From the eastern barbarian tribes performed, their weapons flashing, their movements aggressive and barely controlled. It was meant to appear as entertainment, but carried an unmistakable threat, a display of Qi's military reach and Lu's vulnerability. Confucius recognized the gambit immediately. He stepped forward and addressed the Qi officials with calm authority. This was a meeting between civilized states, he pointed out, not a barbarian raid. The use of such performers violated every principle of diplomatic ritual. Either they withdraw the dancers, or the conference would end immediately, and Lu would report Qi's breach of protocol to all the other states. The Qi delegation, surprised by such forthright resistance from a supposedly weaker party, backed down. The armed dancers were dismissed, and the conference proceeded according to proper forms. More than that, Qi's representatives found themselves outmaneuvered. Confucius' knowledge of ritual and precedent was so thorough, his arguments so carefully constructed, that Duke Jing agreed to return certain territories Qi had taken from Lu in previous conflicts. It was Confucius' greatest political triumph, a victory achieved not through military force, but through moral authority, knowledge, and the skillful use of diplomatic form. Duke Ding returned to Lu celebrated as a successful negotiator, though everyone understood that the true architect of success had been his minister. For a moment, it seemed that virtue could indeed triumph over mere power, that wisdom could defend a state as effectively as armies. Emboldened by this success, Confucius proposed a more ambitious reform. The source of Lu's weakness, he argued, lay in the fortified cities controlled by the three great families, the Ji, Meng, and Shu. These private strongholds allowed the families to maintain armies independent of the duke, to act as states within the state. If these fortifications were dismantled, authority would return to its proper center, and Lu could become truly unified. It was a bold vision, perhaps too bold. Duke Ding, still basking in the glory of the Jiagu conference, agreed. Orders went out for the fortified cities to be reduced. The plan began to be implemented. One city's walls came down without resistance. Then opposition hardened. The great families, realizing that their power base was being systematically destroyed, began to resist their retainers, whose livelihoods depended on the current arrangement, grew restive. What had seemed like a brilliant stroke of political reform revealed itself as a dangerous overreach. The Ji family, most powerful of the three, still nominally supported the plan. But their support was tepid, strategic, revocable. When resistance intensified, they quietly withdrew their backing. Without the Jai family's support, the reform collapsed. The remaining fortified cities retained their walls. The moment of possible transformation passed, and Lu's political structure remained unchanged. Confucius had learned a bitter lesson. Virtue without power could inspire, but not compel, could propose, but not enforce. The great families had tolerated his reforms as long as they affected only minor matters. When he threatened their fundamental interests, tolerance evaporated. Good intentions and moral authority, however admirable, could not overcome entrenched power that had no intention of surrendering its advantages. Then came the final insult, the event that would drive Confucius from Lu forever. In 497 BC, the state of Qi, still alarmed by Lu's growing strength and unity under the minister's guidance, sent a gift to Duke Ding, 80 beautiful female dancers and musicians, along with magnificent horses. The gift was ostensibly a gesture of friendship, but its true purpose was subversion, to distract Lu's ruler from the tedious work of governance with the pleasures of the court. The strategy worked perfectly. Duke Ding received the dancers with delight. For 3 days, he neglected state business. Mesmerized by performances and feasting, important sacrifices went unperformed. Council meetings were postponed. The duke who had stood firm at Jiagu now showed himself weak before entertainment. Confucius watched with mounting disgust. This was precisely the corruption he had spent his life opposing. a ruler abandoning duty for pleasure, choosing immediate gratification over long-term responsibility, allowing himself to be manipulated by a rival state through his own weakness. The Duke's behavior violated everything Confucius had tried to teach about self-cultivation and proper conduct. He waited, hoping the Duke would recover his senses. Days passed. The dancers remained. The Duke's attention remained on them. Confucius realized that nothing would change, that the ruler he had served would not, perhaps could not, choose principle over pleasure. The Ji family, observing this display, made clear they saw no problem with the Duke's conduct. Their lack of support for serious governance had finally become explicit. Confucius made his decision. He would not serve a court that had abandoned virtue so completely. At age 55, having reached the pinnacle of his political career, having demonstrated that his principles could work in practice, he resigned his position and prepared to leave Lu. His students, shocked and dismayed, gathered to hear his explanation. He spoke without anger or bitterness, his tone measured and sad. A minister who could not fulfill his duty must withdraw. A teacher whose advice went unheeded had no choice but to seek a ruler who would listen. The way he taught required commitment from both ruler and minister. Where that commitment was absent, service became complicity. He made his preparations quietly. Some of his disciples chose to accompany him. Others remained in Lu to continue their own work or care for their families. Those who traveled with him understood they were embarking on an uncertain journey. They were leaving stability for wandering, reputation for obscurity, the known for the unknown. As Confucius departed through Lu's gates, he looked back one last time at the city where he had been born, where he had buried his mother, where he had gathered his first students and proven that virtue could govern. The walls stood unchanged, the temples remained, the people continued their daily lives. Yet something had shifted irreversibly. The moment when Lu might have reformed itself under wise guidance had passed. Ahead lay 13 years of wandering, of seeking a ruler who would implement the way, of teaching in exile while the states of China tore themselves apart. Behind lay the ruins of a dream, not his teaching, which continued, but his hope that transformation could come from within the existing order, that the powerful could be persuaded to govern with virtue, that society could reform itself before it destroyed itself. The road stretched before him, and he took it without hesitation. If one state would not listen, perhaps another would. If this generation refused wisdom, perhaps the next would accept it. The teacher had become a wanderer, but the teaching remained unchanged. Somewhere, in some state not yet visited, a ruler might yet be found who understood that true strength came not from force but from virtue, not from wealth but from wisdom, not from power but from the patient cultivation of what was right. The sun began to set as the small band of travelers moved along the dusty road, leaving Lu behind. They did not look like conquerors or heroes, just a group of middle-aged men and their elderly teacher, walking toward an uncertain future, with nothing but their principles and their faith that somewhere, somehow, the way would find its proper home. The age of service had ended. The age of wandering had begun. The gates of Khufu appeared on the horizon like a memory made solid. 13 years had passed since Confucius walked through them as an exile, leaving behind a state that would not listen. Now he returned as an old man, his beard white, his body bent by the weight of endless roads, but his mind as clear as ever and his commitment to the way undiminished. The city had not changed, yet everything felt different. The same walls enclosed the same streets. The same temples stood where he had first studied ritual as a boy. The same market hummed with merchants and farmers. But he was returning not as a reformer with ambitions of political transformation, but as a teacher ready to accept the limits of what one lifetime could achieve. The reception was respectful but measured. Ji Kangzi, the head of the powerful Ji family, who now controlled Lu's government, welcomed him back with courtesy. There would be no high office this time, no position as Minister of Justice, no authority to implement reforms. That door had closed permanently, but he could teach, students could gather, wisdom could be transmitted. And for Confucius, that was enough, perhaps all it had ever really been meant to be. His old disciples rejoiced at his return. Those who had remained in Lu throughout his wandering years came to greet him, many now holding positions in government or established in their careers. They had missed their master's presence, his guidance, his ability to illuminate principles they had studied, but never quite grasped without him. The reunion was warm, touched with the bittersweet awareness that time was short, that the teacher who had seemed eternal was now visibly mortal. New students arrived as well, drawn by his fame. The wandering years had paradoxically enhanced his reputation. Here was a man who had walked away from power rather than compromise his principles, who had endured hardship rather than adjust his teachings, who had been rejected by every court yet never wavered in his conviction. Such integrity commanded respect, especially among young men disillusioned with the corruption they saw around them. Confucius' home became a center of learning once more. In the courtyard, where he had first gathered disciples decades earlier, the conversations resumed, deeper now, enriched by experience, sharpened by the knowledge that time was precious. The master taught with the authority of someone who had tested every principle against reality and found them sound. He knew now, with certainty born from failure and perseverance, that the way was real, even if the world refused to walk it. His teaching in these final years took on new dimensions. He was no longer merely transmitting the wisdom of the ancients, but synthesizing a lifetime of observation, thought, and experience into a coherent philosophy. The scattered insights of his youth organized themselves into a system, not rigid or dogmatic, but organic and complete. A way of understanding human nature, society, and the proper relationship between them. With his senior disciples, Yanhui, Zilu, Zigong, Zhengzi, he engaged in profound discussions that ranged across every aspect of life. They debated the nature of Ren, exploring its subtleties and applications. They discussed when to serve a flawed ruler and when to withdraw. They examined the relationship between inner virtue and outer ritual, between knowledge and action, between the individual and society. These conversations, later collected and preserved, would become the core of the Analects, not a systematic treatise, but a mosaic of teachings, each piece capturing a moment of insight, a question answered, a principle illustrated. The form suited the content. Confucius' philosophy was not a set of abstract rules, but lived wisdom, ideas inseparable from the person who embodied them. Yet even as he taught, he turned his attention to a task he had long contemplated, the preservation and transmission of the ancient texts that formed the foundation of Chinese civilization. The classics, the songs, the histories, the ritual texts existed in various versions, scattered across different states, some complete and some fragmentary, their meanings often obscured by the passage of time. Confucius took upon himself the role of editor and curator. He gathered the texts, compared versions, selected the most authentic, and organized them for future generations. His work was not creative, but critical. He added nothing new, but removed what was spurious, clarified what was obscure, and arranged what was chaotic into coherent order. The Book of Songs received his particular attention. From over 3,000 poems circulating in various collections, he selected 300, organizing them into categories: airs from the states, odes for court ceremonies, and hymns for religious rituals. His selection was guided by moral and educational value. Each poem, he believed, should teach something about human nature, proper conduct, or the relationship between heaven and earth. The 300 songs, he said, can be summed up in one phrase: think no evil. The book of documents, containing speeches and decrees of ancient sage kings, he edited for authenticity and clarity. These texts provided the historical foundation for his political philosophy, demonstrating how the early Zhou rulers had governed through virtue and moral example. By preserving them, he preserved the blueprint for righteous governance. The Book of Rites he helped systematize, though much of this work would continue after his death through his disciples. These texts codified the proper conduct for every aspect of life: births and deaths, marriages and funerals, daily interactions and state ceremonies. They represented the accumulated wisdom of centuries about how form shapes character and ritual cultivates virtue. The Book of Music, now lost to history, received similar attention. Confucius believed music was essential to moral education, that different modes and melodies affected the heart in different ways. Proper music cultivated harmony within the soul. Corrupt music stirred base passions. A state's music revealed its moral condition. Most personally, he compiled the Spring and Autumn Annals, a chronicle of his home state of Lu, covering over 240 years. This was not merely a record of events, but a moral judgment rendered through selective emphasis and careful word choice. By praising virtue and condemning vice, by noting which rituals were properly performed and which neglected, he created a historical text that was also a teaching instrument. Later scholars would spend centuries analyzing his subtle choices of language, finding moral principles embedded in what appeared to be straightforward chronicle. This editorial work was exhausting for a man in his late 60s. It required concentration, comparison of manuscripts, consultation with other scholars, careful decisions about what to include and exclude. Yet Confucius pursued it with the same dedication he had brought to everything else. He understood that he was building a bridge between past and future, ensuring that the wisdom of the ancients would survive the chaos of his own age. Between teaching and editing, he also found time for reflection. His philosophy, developed over decades, reached its mature expression in these final years. He articulated more clearly than ever his vision of the ideal society, one built on 5 fundamental relationships, each characterized by mutual obligation and proper conduct. The relationship between ruler and minister required the ruler to be virtuous and the minister to be loyal, not blind obedience, but loyal advice and faithful service. Between father and son, the father must be loving and the son must be filial. Between husband and wife, the husband must be righteous and the wife supportive. Between elder and younger siblings, the elder must be caring and the younger respectful. Between friends, both must be trustworthy and sincere. These relationships, properly maintained, created the structure of society. Each person occupied multiple roles. One was simultaneously child, parent, subject, friend, and in each role had specific duties. When everyone fulfilled their duties, harmony emerged naturally, without coercion. This was the ancient way, the pattern established by the sage kings, the path back from chaos to order. He also refined his famous statement about the stages of his own life, a kind of spiritual autobiography. At 15, I set my heart on learning. At 30, I stood firm. At 40, I had no more doubts. At 50, I understood heaven's will. At 60, my ear was attuned. At 70, I could follow my heart's desire without overstepping the bounds of propriety. It was a description of gradual cultivation, of virtue developing through decades of effort until it became second nature. At 70, he suggested, right conduct no longer required conscious effort. It flowed naturally from a heart perfectly aligned with the way. This was the goal of all cultivation, to transform oneself so completely that virtue became as natural as breathing. His students watched him with a mixture of reverence and concern. They saw his energy flagging, noticed how the work tired him more quickly than before. Yet his mind remained sharp, his teaching as profound as ever. In his presence, they felt both the weight of tradition he carried and the living vitality of wisdom that was not merely ancient but eternal, applicable to every age. Yan Hui, his beloved disciple, often sat closest during these teaching sessions, absorbing every word with the intensity of someone who understood how precious time had become. Zilu continued his protective vigilance, though what he protected now was not his master's body, but his time and energy, shielding him from excessive demands. Zigong, increasingly successful in his diplomatic and commercial ventures, made sure the master wanted for nothing materially. Zhengzi carefully recorded the teachings, recognizing that preservation would soon become crucial. The government of Lu occasionally consulted Confucius on matters of ritual or education, but not on policy or reform. He accepted this limitation without bitterness. He had learned that transformation happened slowly, that seeds planted in one generation might not bloom until the next, that his role was to preserve and transmit rather than to implement and rule. In the evenings, he sometimes walked alone through Khufu's streets, past houses where lamps glowed softly, past temples where rituals were performed with the carelessness that had always pained him, past the walls that separated Lu from the wilderness beyond. The world remained broken, but he had done what he could. The teaching existed, the classics were preserved, the students were trained. Whether future generations would accept the gift he offered was beyond his control. On clear nights, he gazed at the stars, the same stars the ancient sage kings had observed when they charted the calendar and regulated the seasons. He felt connected to them across the centuries, part of an unbroken chain of those who sought to understand heaven's pattern and implement it on earth. The chain had weakened in his age, but it had not broken. As long as one person held the way, transmission remained possible. The seasons turned. Spring brought blossoms to the apricot trees where he taught. Summer brought heat that made the old scholar drowsy. Autumn brought harvest and the satisfaction of gathered work. Winter brought cold that settled into aging bones. Each season felt more precious than the last. Each lesson potentially the final one. Each conversation with students a gift that might not be repeated. Confucius knew his time was short. He had accomplished much, preserved the classics, trained disciples who would carry on the teaching, articulated a philosophy that could guide society toward harmony. Yet he had also failed. No state had implemented his vision. No ruler had governed by virtue. The chaos continued unabated. The question that haunted his final years was whether his life's work would matter, whether the seeds he had planted would ever grow, or whether they would simply be forgotten in the gathering storm. He did not know the answer. He could only trust that truth, once articulated clearly enough, had a power of its own, that wisdom eventually found those who sought it, that the way, though rejected by his generation, might be embraced by another. As the year 479 BC approached, he continued teaching, editing, discussing, and praying, that time would grant him enough days to finish what he had started. The work was nearly complete. The teaching was nearly perfected. The transmission was nearly secured. But history was not finished with him yet. The final lessons, the hardest ones, were still to come. The losses came like waves, each one wearing away at the shore of an old man's heart. Confucius had survived exile and wandering, rejection and hunger, assassination attempts and political failure. He had endured these trials with remarkable equanimity, maintaining his faith in the way, even when the world seemed determined to prove him wrong. But the deaths that marked his final years struck deeper than any external hardship, touching the private sorrows that philosophy could explain but not prevent. The first loss was his son, Kong Li, the man sometimes called Boyu, carp, after the fish his father had received as a gift on the day of his birth. The relationship between father and son had never been warm. Confucius, whose own father had died when he was 3, seemed never to have learned the art of paternal intimacy. He was correct with his son, proper in all duties, but distant. His heart belonged to his students, his mission, his vision of transforming society. Kong Li lived in the shadow of a great man, known primarily as Confucius's son, rather than as himself. When Kong Li died, still relatively young before his father, the grief was complicated by guilt and regret. Confucius mourned according to proper ritual, observing every requirement of filial conduct now directed upward from father to son. Yet those who knew him well sensed something beyond ritual grief, the quiet acknowledgement of a relationship that had never fully blossomed, conversations that had never happened, affection that had been assumed rather than expressed. He had taught the world about proper conduct between father and son, yet in his own family, that relationship remained somehow incomplete. Kong Li left behind a son, Zisi, who would become a scholar in his own right, preserving and developing his grandfather's teachings. Through him, at least, the line would continue, and the transmission of wisdom would pass to another generation. But the loss reminded Confucius of mortality's approach, of time running out, of how much remained unfinished. The second death struck far deeper. Yan Hui, the beloved disciple, the student who had understood the teaching most profoundly, died young. The news reached Confucius like a physical blow. Yan Hui, who had shared the hardships of the wandering years without complaint. Yan Hui, who lived in poverty yet maintained perfect equanimity. Yan Hui, who alone among all the disciples seemed to grasp not just the words, but the spirit of the way. Yan Hui, who was supposed to carry the teaching forward into the next generation. When told of Yan Hui's death, Confucius cried out in anguish, "Heaven has bereft me. Heaven has bereft me." It was a cry of grief so raw, so uncontrolled, that his other disciples were startled. They had never seen their master lose composure in this way. His sorrow poured out without restraint, tears flowing freely. The disciples tried to comfort him. "Master, you are grieving excessively," they said gently, concerned that such emotional display violated the very principles of moderation he had taught them. Confucius looked at them through his tears and replied, "Am I grieving excessively? If I do not grieve excessively for this man, for whom should I grieve?" It was both rebuke and teaching. There was a time for restraint and a time for grief. There were losses that demanded the full measure of sorrow, relationships that deserved the breaking of composure. Yan Hui had been more than a student. He had been the one in whom the teaching had taken deepest root, the proof that virtue was not merely theoretical, but achievable. His death felt like the death of possibility itself. Confucius mourned Yan Hui as one mourns a son, perhaps more deeply than he had mourned his actual son. The disciples understood. Yan Hui had been the spiritual heir, the one who would have carried the way forward with perfect understanding, now that hope was extinguished. The master was 70 years old, his health declining, and his best student was gone. Not long after, news arrived of another death, this one violent and tragic. Zilu, the brave and impulsive warrior scholar, had been killed in the state of Wei. He had entered service there after the wandering years, serving under a lord who became embroiled in a political coup. When chaos erupted, Zilu rushed to defend his master, fighting against overwhelming odds. In the midst of battle, his cap was struck from his head. Even then, even surrounded by enemies with death certain, Zilu paused to tie his cap properly. "A gentleman dies with his cap on," he said, maintaining ritual propriety even in his final moment. Then he was cut down, his body torn apart by the attackers. When word reached Confucius, he was stricken with a different kind of grief. Yan Hui's death had been natural, though untimely. Zilu's was violent, unnecessary, the result of a loyalty that Confucius himself had taught, but which in this case had led only to waste. The master ordered that all pickled meat be thrown out of the house. The method of Zilu's death had involved his body being preserved in such a manner, and Confucius could not bear the association. "I knew he would die violently," Confucius said quietly to his remaining disciples. Zilu's courage had always tended toward recklessness, his loyalty toward stubbornness. The master had tried to temper these qualities, to teach that true courage included knowing when to withdraw, that loyalty must be guided by wisdom. But Zilu had remained Zilu, honorable, brave, and ultimately unable to calculate odds when duty called. 2 of his finest disciples gone, his son gone. Confucius felt the weight of accumulating loss. He was an old man now, increasingly isolated by mortality, surrounded by a diminishing circle of those who had walked the path with him from the beginning. Around this time, hunters in the countryside near Lu captured a strange creature. It was described as having a single horn, the body of a deer, the tail of an ox, and hooves of a horse. To those versed in ancient lore, it resembled the Shilin, a mythical beast said to appear only in ages of great virtue, or to herald the arrival of a sage. But this Kailin was wounded, captured, abandoned, a sign inverted, an omen corrupted. When Confucius heard of it, he went to see the creature. Standing before the wounded beast, he wept. "My way is finished," he said. The Kailin, symbol of perfect harmony between heaven and earth, had appeared at last, but injured and doomed, just as the way itself seemed injured and doomed in this age. It was as though the universe itself was confirming what he had always feared, that his teachings, though true, had arrived at the wrong time, that the world was not ready for what he offered. He returned home and set down his brush. He had been compiling the spring and autumn annals, but now he brought the chronicle to an end at the year of the Kilin's capture. The symbolism was clear to him. History had reached a point of such disorder that even heavenly signs appeared only to suffer. There was nothing more to record. His health declined through the winter and spring. The strength that had carried him through 13 years of wandering, that had sustained him through decades of teaching, began to fail. He grew weaker, his appetite diminished, his energy ebbed. He spent more time resting, less time with students. The disciples gathered more frequently, sensing the approaching end, wanting to be near him while time remained. Yet even in weakness, his mind stayed clear. When disciples visited, he still answered their questions, still offered guidance, still pointed them toward the way. His body might be failing, but his commitment never wavered. He had one task remaining, to ensure the transmission would continue after he was gone. To Zhengji, the earnest student who had devoted himself to preserving the master's teachings, he entrusted the continuation of the school. Zhengzi lacked Yan Hui's brilliance and Zilu's courage, but he possessed something equally valuable: faithfulness. He would record accurately, transmit carefully, preserve what had been taught without distorting it through excessive interpretation. To Zigong, the clever and successful diplomat, he expressed confidence that the teaching would find practical application in the world of affairs. Zigong's worldly success demonstrated that virtue and effectiveness need not be opposites, that wisdom could flourish even in the realm of politics and commerce. To the younger disciples, he offered final encouragements to continue their studies, to practice self-cultivation, to never abandon the way, no matter how difficult the age became. The world might not accept their teaching, but that did not make the teaching less true. They must persist, must transmit, must trust that eventually, perhaps generations hence, someone would listen. In the early spring of 479 BC, Kong Chu took to his bed. The illness was not sudden or dramatic, simply the gradual failing of a body that had served for 72 years and could serve no longer. His disciples maintained vigil, taking turns sitting with him, making sure he was comfortable, hoping perhaps for final words of wisdom, for some summary teaching that would distill everything he had taught into one perfect phrase. But Kong Qiu offered no dramatic final pronouncement. He had already said what needed saying, had already lived the teaching as fully as any human could. In his final days, he drifted between sleep and waking, sometimes recognizing those around him, sometimes lost in memories or dreams. One morning, he struggled to rise, though his body could barely support him. With help, he stood and walked slowly to the doorway of his home, leaning heavily on a disciple. He stood there for a long moment, looking out at the courtyard, at the apricot trees where he had taught, at the city of Khufu stretching beyond his walls, at the world that had been his home and his classroom and his constant frustration. "The great mountain must crumble," he said quietly. "The mighty beam must break. The wise man must wither away." It was not despair, but acceptance, the recognition that all things, even the greatest, must pass. Even the teaching, though eternal in its truth, must for a time seem to fail, must wait in silence until the world was ready to hear again. He returned to his bed. A few days later, surrounded by his disciples, Kong Qiu died peacefully. It was the spring of 479 BC. He was 72 or 73 years old, depending on how one counted. The man born Kong Qiu, known as Master Kong, called Confucius by later generations, had completed his journey. The disciples prepared his body according to proper ritual, performing every ceremony with meticulous care. They knew he would have wanted it done correctly, that for him form mattered because it shaped the heart. They dressed him in the robes of a scholar, arranged his body with dignity, and kept vigil through the night. His burial took place north of Khufu, near the Xi River. The disciples mourned him for 3 years, as was proper for mourning a parent. Some built huts near his grave and stayed even longer. Zigong remained for 6 years, unable to leave the place where his master rested, still seeking wisdom from the man who had transformed his life. What remained behind was not a kingdom or a fortune. Kong Qiu died as he had lived much of his life, without political power, without great wealth, without having seen his vision implemented by worldly measures. He might have been counted a failure. No state had adopted his teachings. No ruler had governed according to his principles. The chaos he had hoped to transform continued unabated. But he had left something more enduring than political success. He had trained disciples who would carry the teaching forward. He had preserved the classics that contained the wisdom of the ancients. He had articulated a philosophy of such depth and humanity that it would resonate across millennia. He had lived with such integrity that his life itself became a teaching. In the years immediately following his death, the impact was subtle. His disciples scattered to various states, teaching in his name, trying to implement what they had learned. The world continued its descent into the chaos that would culminate in the Warring States period. It seemed, perhaps, that Confucius had been right to weep at the wounded Qilin, right to believe his way was finished. But seeds do not sprout the day they are planted. Ideas do not transform societies in a single generation. What Confucius had begun would take centuries to reach its full flowering. The teaching would survive, would spread, would eventually become the foundation of Chinese civilization and influence cultures far beyond China's borders. For now, in the spring of 479 BC, there was only a grave north of Khufu, a gathering of grieving disciples, and the question that hangs over every death. Did this life matter? Would these teachings endure? The answer lay not in the present, but in the future, in generations yet unborn who would read his words, embrace his philosophy, and find in his teaching a path through their own troubled times. The master was gone, but the way remained, waiting patiently for the world to catch up to the wisdom of a man who had been born 500 years too soon, or perhaps at exactly the right time to plant seeds for an eternal harvest. The spring wind moved through the trees of Khufu, carrying with it the promise of growth, of continuity, of life emerging from death. And somewhere in that wind, if one listened carefully, one might hear the echo of an old man's voice, still teaching, still pointing toward the way. The master was gone, but his voice remained. In the weeks and months following Confucius' death, his disciples gathered not to mourn alone, but to remember together. They shared stories of what he had said and done, compared notes on his teachings, debated the meaning of his actions. Each had seen the master from a different angle, heard different lessons, received guidance tailored to their particular needs. Now, in conversation, they began to assemble these fragments into something whole. From these discussions emerged the text that would become the Analects, Lunyu in Chinese, literally sorted sayings. It was not written all at once, nor by a single hand. Different disciples contributed different sections, recording conversations they remembered, teachings they had witnessed, moments that had illuminated the way. The text that gradually took form was fragmentary, conversational, sometimes contradictory in its details. Yet somehow this very incompleteness made it more authentic, more alive than any systematic treatise could have been. The Analects captured Confucius as he actually was, teaching through dialogue, responding to individual students, using questions more than declarations, revealing wisdom through stories rather than abstract propositions. Reading it felt less like studying doctrine and more like sitting in that courtyard beneath the apricot trees, listening to an old man respond to his students with patience, humor, and profound insight. Zhengzi, the earnest disciple whom Confucius had trusted to preserve the teaching, became one of the primary transmitters. He established his own school, gathering students and teaching them not just the master's words, but his spirit, the emphasis on filial piety, on loyalty, on the constant practice of self-examination. Each day I examine myself on 3 points, he taught, echoing Confucius' methodology. Have I been disloyal in serving others? Have I been untrustworthy in my dealings with friends? Have I failed to practice what I was taught? Zigong, whose diplomatic skills and commercial success made him wealthy and influential, used his position to spread the master's reputation. He traveled between states, negotiating treaties and facilitating trade, and wherever he went, he spoke of his teacher with reverence and affection. Through zigong, nobles and officials who had never met Confucius learned of his wisdom, his integrity, his vision of virtuous governance. The teaching began to seep into the conversations of courts and councils, planted by a student who had mastered the art of making ideas travel. Kong Li's son, Zisi, though he had not known his grandfather intimately, devoted himself to understanding and extending the teaching. He became a scholar and philosopher in his own right, writing works that developed themes Confucius had introduced through Zisi. The family line continued not merely biologically, but intellectually, creating a dynasty of thought that paralleled and perhaps exceeded the political dynasties that rose and fell around it. Other disciples scattered across the fractured landscape of China, each establishing schools, taking students, adapting the teaching to local circumstances while trying to preserve its essential core. Some emphasized ritual and tradition, others focused on moral self-cultivation, still others concentrated on practical statecraft. The teaching that had been unified in Confucius' person began to branch and diversify, like a tree sending out limbs in different directions, yet rooted in the same trunk. The decades that followed the master's death were turbulent. The spring and autumn period, already chaotic during Confucius' lifetime, gave way to the Warring States period, an age of even greater violence and disorder. The feudal system of Zhou completely collapsed. States that had once been bound by ritual and shared culture now fought wars of annihilation. Armies grew larger, battles more brutal, philosophies more desperate in their search for solutions. In this cauldron of conflict, many schools of thought competed for influence. The Taoists, following Laozi's teachings, advocated withdrawal from society and harmony with natural patterns. The Mohists preached universal love and utilitarian ethics. The legalists argued for strict laws and harsh punishments, for a state governed by regulations rather than virtue. Each school claimed to have the answer to China's crisis. Confucianism, as the teaching of Confucius came to be called, was merely one voice among many, and not always the loudest. Its emphasis on tradition, ritual, and gradual moral cultivation seemed quaint to rulers who needed immediate solutions to existential threats. Its insistence on virtuous governance seemed naive in an age when survival depended on military strength and strategic cunning. For a time, it seemed the teaching might be forgotten, overwhelmed by more aggressive and pragmatic philosophies. Then, a century after Confucius' death, a new voice emerged. Mencius, Mengzi in Chinese, was born around 372 BC into a world that had never known the master personally, but that desperately needed what he had taught. Mencius became Confucianism's second founder, developing and defending the philosophy with such brilliance that later generations would pair them together. Confucius and Mencius, the two sages whose teachings were inseparable. Mencius made a crucial philosophical contribution. He argued that human nature was inherently good. People possessed innate moral tendencies, compassion for others' suffering, shame at wrongdoing, respect for worthy individuals, the ability to distinguish right from wrong. These were seeds that required cultivation, but that existed in every person from birth. Education's task was not to impose virtue from outside, but to nurture what was already within. This optimistic view of human nature gave Confucianism a new foundation. If people were naturally good, then Confucius' emphasis on moral education made perfect sense. Society failed not because humans were irredeemably flawed, but because their natural goodness had been neglected or corrupted. Restore proper education, provide virtuous examples, create the right environment, and human nature would flourish as it was meant to. Mencius also developed Confucius' political philosophy in a more radical direction. He articulated what would later be called the right of revolution. If a ruler failed to govern virtuously, if he oppressed his people and abandoned his responsibilities, he lost the mandate of heaven. The people had the right, indeed the duty, to remove such a ruler and replace him with someone worthy. It was a dangerous teaching in an age of absolute monarchs, yet it planted the seed of accountability that would influence Chinese political thought for millennia. Like his predecessor, Mencius spent years traveling from state to state, seeking a ruler who would implement virtuous governance. Like Confucius, he was received with respect but little real authority. Like his master, he eventually returned to teaching and writing, trusting that ideas would triumph even when immediate application failed. His book, later simply called the Mencius, became one of the 4 books that would form the core of Confucian education. Around the same time, another brilliant mind was developing Confucian thought in a very different direction. Zhunzi, born around 310 BC, argued the opposite of Mencius. Human nature, he insisted, was inherently selfish and prone to evil. Left to themselves, humans would pursue only their own desires, resulting in chaos and conflict. Civilization existed precisely to restrain and transform this flawed nature through ritual, education, and discipline. This darker view led Zhunzi to emphasize structure and form even more strongly than Confucius had. Ritual was not merely expression of inner virtue, but the mechanism by which virtue was created, through constant practice of proper forms, through submission to rules and ceremonies. The raw selfishness of natural humans could be gradually refined into something approaching goodness. Education was not nurturing, but reformation, not cultivation, but reconstruction. Despite these differences, Zhunzi considered himself a faithful transmitter of Confucius' teaching. He venerated the master, taught the classics, and devoted himself to preserving what he saw as authentic Confucianism against various distortions. His emphasis on institutions, laws, and structured society would deeply influence later Chinese governance. Ironically, 2 of his most brilliant students, Han Feizi and Li Si, would abandon Confucianism entirely and develop legalism, the philosophy that would nearly destroy everything Confucius had built. As the Warring States period ground toward its violent conclusion, the state of Qin rose to dominance through ruthless application of legalist principles. Qin's rulers rejected virtue in favor of law, rejected tradition in favor of innovation, rejected the moral cultivation Confucius had taught in favor of strict punishments and rewards. They built the most efficient military machine China had ever seen, and with it, they conquered every rival state. In 221 BC, Qin Shi Huang unified China under his absolute rule, establishing the Qin dynasty. He was an emperor unlike anything the ancient sage kings had represented, a tyrant who ruled through fear, who built his empire on the bones of countless dead, who saw himself as the beginning of history rather than its continuation. And he viewed Confucianism as a threat. In 213 BC, following the advice of his legalist minister Li Si, Qin Shi Huang ordered the burning of books. Confucian texts, historical records, poetry collections, anything that celebrated the past or questioned centralized authority, were to be destroyed. Scholars who protested were executed, some buried alive. The teachings of Confucius, which had survived 2 centuries through careful transmission and devoted study, faced systematic annihilation. Yet even in this darkest hour, the teaching survived. Scholars hid texts, memorized classics, passed knowledge secretly from teacher to student. Some fled to remote areas where the emperor's reach was weaker. Others buried manuscripts, hoping to recover them when the persecution ended. The Analects, the Mencius, the five classics, all were preserved through courage and sacrifice, through the conviction that what Confucius had taught was too valuable to let die. The Qin dynasty, for all its power, lasted barely 15 years. Qin Shi Huang's death in 210 BC was followed by immediate collapse. The empire he had built through force fragmented almost overnight. From the chaos emerged the Han dynasty in 206 BC, and with it came a fundamental shift in Chinese civilization. The early Han rulers governed pragmatically, mixing various philosophies as circumstances demanded. But gradually, thoughtful officials began to recognize that legalism alone could not sustain an empire. Force could conquer, but could not govern. Terror could suppress, but could not inspire. What was needed was legitimacy, moral authority, a vision that gave meaning to power, rather than merely exercising it. In 141 BC, Emperor Wu ascended the throne. His advisor, Dong Zhongshu, convinced him that Confucianism offered what the empire needed: a philosophy of governance that emphasized moral authority, that connected earthly rule to heavenly mandate, that provided structure and meaning to social relationships. More practically, Confucianism offered a ready-made bureaucracy. Scholars trained in the classics, educated in administration, committed to service rather than personal ambition. Emperor Wu made the decisive choice. Confucianism would become state orthodoxy. The Confucian classics became the basis for civil service examinations. To serve in government, one had to master the texts that preserved Confucius' teaching. The philosophy that had been rejected by every ruler of the master's own age became the foundation of the Chinese state, shaping how officials were selected, educated, and evaluated. This was triumph, but it came with a price. Confucianism became institutionalized, fossilized, transformed from lived wisdom into official doctrine. The dynamic teaching that Confucius had adapted to each student became rigid curriculum. The philosophy that questioned authority became the authority that resisted questioning. Success brought its own dangers. The danger of becoming what one had opposed, of forgetting the spirit while preserving the letter. Yet even in this transformation, something essential remained. The civil service examinations, based on mastery of Confucian texts, created a meritocracy, imperfect but real, where talent mattered more than birth. The emphasis on education produced the most literate ruling class in human history. The teaching about virtue and self-cultivation, even when honored more in theory than practice, established standards by which rulers could be judged and found wanting. By the end of the Han dynasty's first century, Confucianism had become inseparable from Chinese civilization itself. The temples that honored Confucius now stood in every major city. His descendants, the Kong family, were granted special status and privileges. Students memorized his words. Scholars debated his meanings. Officials invoked his authority. The man who had died thinking himself a failure had become the most influential teacher in Chinese history. The philosophy rejected by his own generation had shaped every generation that followed. The way that seemed finished with the wounded, Qilin, had proven as indestructible as truth itself. From the grave north of Khufu, the teaching had spread across an empire, carried not by armies, but by students, not by force, but by persuasion, not by power, but by the quiet persistence of ideas that answered humanity's deepest needs. Confucius had planted seeds in the worst possible soil, during the worst possible season, yet somehow, miraculously, those seeds had grown into a forest that sheltered millions. The master had been right about one thing. The way was real. He had been wrong about another. It was not finished. It had barely begun. Time moves differently for ideas than it does for empires. Dynasties rise and fall in centuries. Kingdoms flourish and crumble in decades. But a teaching that answers something fundamental in the human heart can endure for millennia, adapting to each age while remaining essentially itself. The words of a man who died in 479 BC would shape civilizations he never imagined, influence cultures he never knew existed, and speak to people living in a world he could never have conceived. For more than 2,000 years, Confucianism was not merely a philosophy in China. It was the architecture of civilization itself. It shaped how emperors governed and how farmers raised their children, how scholars thought and how merchants conducted business, how families organized themselves and how society understood its purpose. The teachings that had seemed so impractical to the rulers of Confucius' own age became the foundation upon which the world's longest continuous civilization was built. The civil service examination system, established during the Han Dynasty and refined over centuries, embodied his vision more completely than any reform he had proposed in his lifetime. To serve the emperor, candidates had to master the Confucian classics, the Analects, the Mencius, the Great Learning, the Doctrine of the Mean, and the 5 classics that Confucius himself had preserved and edited. They had to demonstrate not just knowledge, but understanding, not just memorization, but the ability to apply ancient wisdom to contemporary problems. This system created something unprecedented, a meritocracy based on learning rather than birth. A poor farmer's son, if talented and dedicated enough, could study the classics, pass the examinations, and rise to the highest levels of government. It was imperfect. The wealthy still had advantages, connections still mattered, corruption still existed. Yet it represented a fundamental commitment to the idea that virtue and ability, cultivated through education, mattered more than aristocratic lineage. For over 1,300 years, from the Tang dynasty through the Qing, these examinations shaped Chinese culture. Every educated person memorized the same texts, internalized the same values, participated in the same intellectual tradition. The Analects became as familiar as breathing. Confucius' words about benevolence, righteousness, filial piety, proper conduct, formed the common language through which Chinese civilization understood itself. The 5 relationships that he had articulated became the structure of society: ruler and subject, father and son, husband and wife, elder and younger, friend and friend. Each relationship carried specific obligations that, when fulfilled, created harmony, rippling outward from the family to the empire itself. Filial piety especially became the cornerstone of Chinese ethics, the virtue from which all others flowed: to honor one's parents, to care for them in old age, to mourn them properly after death, to continue their legacy. These were not merely personal choices, but sacred duties that bound generations together. Yet Confucianism was never static. Each age reinterpreted the teaching according to its needs, finding in Confucius' words answers to questions he never directly addressed. During the Song dynasty, from 960 to 1279 AD, a renaissance of Confucian thought emerged. Scholars like Zhu Xi synthesized Confucian ethics with metaphysical concepts borrowed partly from Buddhism and Taoism, creating what would be called Neo-Confucianism. This new interpretation delved deeper into questions about the nature of reality, the relationship between principle and material force, the way universal patterns manifested in particular things. It became more philosophical, more systematic, more concerned with cosmology and epistemology. Yet at its heart remained Confucius' core insights, that self-cultivation was the foundation of all improvement, that moral education could transform both person and society, that virtue was humanity's highest calling. Neo-Confucianism became the orthodox interpretation for the next 7 centuries, taught in schools, enforced in examinations, shaping how educated Chinese understood their world. Through it, Confucius' teaching reached even deeper into Chinese consciousness, becoming not just social philosophy, but a complete worldview encompassing ethics, politics, metaphysics, and spirituality. Beyond China's borders, the teachings spread across East Asia, like concentric circles from a stone dropped in water. Korea embraced Confucianism with such devotion that it arguably became more Confucian than China itself. The Joseon dynasty, ruling from 1392 to 1910, made Neo-Confucianism its state ideology, structuring every aspect of Korean life according to Confucian principles. Korean scholars debated fine points of ritual and ethics with an intensity that would have pleased the master himself. In Japan, Confucianism blended with indigenous traditions and the warrior ethos of the samurai class. Japanese scholars adapted Confucius' teachings about loyalty and duty to their feudal system, creating a synthesis that emphasized obligation to one's lord as the highest virtue. The way of the samurai, Bushido, owed much to Confucian ethics, even as it transformed them to fit Japanese circumstances. Vietnam, too, absorbed Confucianism deeply, establishing its own examination system based on the Chinese model and structuring its society according to Confucian principles. From the mountains of Korea to the tropical coasts of Vietnam, from the islands of Japan to the steppes bordering China, Confucius' teaching spread not through conquest, but through the quiet authority of wisdom that worked. Yet the legacy was complex, carrying both light and shadow. Confucianism brought order, literacy, moral seriousness, and a vision of virtuous governance that held rulers accountable to higher principles. But it also brought rigid hierarchy, restriction of women's freedom, resistance to change, and sometimes an oppressive emphasis on conformity over individuality. The same system that elevated learning could stifle creativity. The same emphasis on family duty that created stability could crush personal aspiration. The same respect for tradition that preserved wisdom could prevent adaptation to new circumstances. As the modern era dawned, these tensions became impossible to ignore. When European powers forced their way into East Asia in the 19th century, bringing technologies, ideas, and military might that seemed to render traditional ways obsolete, Confucianism faced its greatest crisis. Western observers dismissed it as feudal remnant, obstacle to progress. The reason Asia had fallen behind the industrializing West Chinese reformers began to question whether the teachings of an ancient sage could guide nations in an age of steamships, telegraphs, and democratic revolutions. The May 4th movement of 1919 crystallized this rejection. Chinese intellectuals, despairing over their nation's weakness and humiliation, blamed Confucian tradition for fostering passivity, hierarchy, and blind obedience to authority. "Down with the Confucian shop" became a rallying cry. The examination system was abolished. The classics were removed from school curricula. Confucius himself was denounced as a reactionary whose teachings had kept China backward for 2 millennia. The criticism intensified during the Cultural Revolution from 1966 to 1976, When Red Guards attacked Confucius as the embodiment of feudal oppression, they destroyed temples, burned texts, desecrated the cemetery at Khufu, where he and his descendants were buried. The Kong family compound, preserved for over 2,000 years, was vandalized. Statues were toppled, scrolls torn, the physical remnants of his legacy subjected to systematic destruction. Yet even this assault could not erase what had been internalized over millennia. Values cultivated across 100 generations do not disappear with the burning of temples. The emphasis on education, on family, on self-improvement, on harmony, these had become woven into the fabric of Chinese identity. When the fury of revolution subsided, what remained was not a clean slate, but a culture still shaped, however ambiguously, by teachings first articulated beside the Sai River 25 centuries earlier. In recent decades, interest in Confucius has revived in China and across East Asia. Scholars debate his relevance to modern challenges. Can Confucian ethics address human rights, gender equality, democratic governance, environmental crisis? Some argue that his teaching must be transcended, that its historical role is complete. Others insist that properly understood and adapted, Confucian wisdom offers resources for addressing precisely the problems that plague contemporary society: alienation, breakdown of community, loss of moral center, confusion about human purpose. Confucius Institutes have opened in universities around the world, promoting Chinese language and culture, keeping his name visible on a global stage. Whether they represent genuine transmission of his teaching or merely political soft power remains debated. Yet they testify to the enduring power of his name, to the conviction that what he taught still matters, even in an age he could never have imagined. Perhaps what endures most powerfully is not any specific teaching, but an approach to life, a way of being human that he exemplified. The commitment to constant self-improvement, the belief that virtue can be cultivated through practice, the insistence that how we treat others matters profoundly, the conviction that education and moral development are lifelong pursuits, the faith that individual transformation can ripple outward to transform families, communities, nations, and the world. In Khufu, where it all began, the temple complex honoring Kong Chu still stands, rebuilt after every destruction, restored after every assault. Visitors from around the world walk through its courtyards, beneath trees descended from those he might have seen, past stone tablets carved with his words. The cemetery where he was buried has become the Kong Forest, the longest documented family cemetery in history, where his descendants, identifiable through meticulous genealogical records spanning more than 2,000 years, continue to be buried beside their ancient ancestor. It is a quiet place, these sacred grounds in Khufu. The noise of the modern city fades as one passes through the gates. Time seems to move differently here, as though the centuries compress, as though the old scholar might still be sitting beneath those trees, waiting patiently for students to arrive with their questions. And in a sense, he is still waiting, still teaching. Every person who reads the Analects enters that conversation, begun so long ago. Every student who struggles with self-cultivation walks the path he first marked out. Every person who chooses principle over expedience, who treats others with the respect they desire for themselves, who seeks to improve both self and society, these carry forward the work he began. The particulars have changed beyond recognition. He knew nothing of computers or constitutions, democracy or human rights, climate change or genetic engineering. Yet the questions he asked remain urgent. What does it mean to be a good person? How should society be organized? What obligations do we owe one another? How can we cultivate virtue in ourselves and inspire it in others? What is the relationship between individual excellence and collective flourishing? These are not ancient questions, but eternal ones, asked anew by each generation, requiring answers both timeless and timely. Confucius' genius was not in providing final answers, but in articulating the questions with such clarity and demonstrating through his own life such commitment to pursuing them that his example continues to illuminate paths forward through darkness. He would have appreciated the irony. The man who died thinking himself a failure became one of history's most successful teachers. The philosophy rejected by his generation shaped every generation that followed. The way that seemed finished with the wounded Qilin proved as enduring as stone, as adaptable as water, as necessary as breath. As evening falls over Khufu, shadows lengthen across the temple courtyards. Incense smoke rises from offerings left by visitors, carrying prayers and gratitude upward. In the archive rooms, scholars still study ancient texts, still debate interpretations, still seek wisdom in words written on silk and bamboo 25 centuries ago. In schools across East Asia and beyond, students still memorize his sayings, still contemplate their meaning, still struggle to apply them to their lives. The old man who walked dusty roads seeking a ruler who would listen never found that ruler, but he found something more valuable: students who would carry his teaching forward generation after generation, ensuring that the wisdom he had gathered from the ancients would not die with him. He planted seeds in the worst possible soil during the worst possible season, yet those seeds grew into a forest that shelters millions. The spring wind moves through the trees of Khufu, the same wind that moved through them when Confucius last stood in his doorway, looking out at the world he was about to leave. In that wind, constant yet ever-changing, lies perhaps the deepest symbol of his legacy: endurance through adaptation, persistence through flexibility, continuity achieved not through rigidity but through living response to each moment's needs. He taught about ritual, yet his teaching transcended any ritual. He spoke of tradition, yet he created something radically new. He looked backward to the sage kings, yet he pointed forward to possibilities yet unrealized. He lived in a small corner of ancient China, yet he spoke to all humanity. He died 2,500 years ago, yet he remains alive wherever people strive to be better, to treat others justly, to cultivate wisdom and virtue. In the end, this is his legacy: not a set of doctrines to be memorized or rules to be followed, but an invitation to join a conversation about what it means to be fully human, to live well together, to create society worthy of our highest aspirations. The conversation continues in every classroom where ethics are discussed, every home where parents teach children respect and kindness, every moment when someone chooses the difficult right over the easy wrong. The grave north of Khufu holds only bones, but the teaching, the vision, the way, these cannot be buried. They live in every person who reads his words and recognizes truth, who practices self-cultivation and discovers transformation, who looks at society's chaos and believes, despite everything, that wisdom and virtue matter more than force and cunning. The quiet conqueror conquered not through armies, but through ideas, not through power, but through persistence, not through fear, but through faith in humanity's capacity for goodness. His empire was built not of stone, but of words, not in space, but in time, not through domination, but through inspiration. And so, the old man sits still beneath the apricot trees, patient and eternal, waiting for the next student to arrive with questions, ready to begin again the conversation that has no end, pointing always toward the way that can be walked but never completely described, lived but never exhausted, transmitted from heart to heart across the generations until the last human voice falls silent. Until then, the teaching continues. The way remains. And in the groves of Khufu, beneath trees that have stood for centuries, the wind carries still the echo of a voice that first spoke there 2,500 years ago, saying simply, gently, to anyone willing to listen, is it not a pleasure, having learned something, to try it out at due intervals? Is it not a joy to have friends come from afar? Is it not gentlemanly not to take offense when others fail to appreciate your abilities? The questions wait for answers. The way waits for walkers. The teaching waits for students. And somewhere in the silence between the words, the old master smiles.